This episode of the .NET Core podcast is brought to you in part by RJJ Software. RJJ Software is dedicated to helping you realize your company's digital potential through innovative solutions using the latest technologies. Utilizing the latest in .NET and cloud technologies, we can help you build the solution your business needs on time and under budget. We have world-class experience in cross-platform development using the latest iterations of the Microsoft technology stack. This includes .NET Core, SQL Server, and Azure. Is Azure not your thing? That's fine, because we have experience in AWS, GCP, Linode, and DigitalOcean too. We know what it means to have to be able to iterate quickly and how important DevOps practices are when it comes to remaining agile. As such, we have experts in the major build and release pipelines, from Azure DevOps to AWS, from Netlify to Travis CI, AppVeyor, and everything in between. So get in touch today at rjj-software.co.uk or check the show notes for a link. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman-Taylor, and this is episode 44, Learning .NET with Mark Price. In this episode, I interviewed Mark about some of the ways to learn .NET Core and a little on his history with educating others within the Microsoft tech stack. Some of you may know Mark from his extensive experience of being a Microsoft certified trainer, his work at EpiServer, or from the latest edition of his book, C# 8 and .NET Core 3, available from Pact Publishing. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So the first thing I'd like to say, Mark, is thank you ever so much for taking the time out of your Friday evening to talk to me about your recent book and your history in the .NET and Microsoft ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here.
Excellent. I'm always glad to hear that guests are pleased to be here because it makes it a better episode. So I was wondering, could you perhaps start by giving us a brief introduction to yourself and maybe the listeners who haven't seen any of your work before or anything like that?
Yes, of course. Happy to. So my name is Mark Price. I'm based in London in the UK, and I've been working with Microsoft developer tools and technologies for pretty much my whole career. And I'm rapidly approaching 50 now, so that's a pretty long time. I'd like to describe myself as an expert educator from a family of educators. My sister was a primary school teacher. I have cousins in education as well. And my grandfather sort of taught at the military academy at Sandhurst. So a lot of educators in my family. And when I was a teenager back in the 1980s, I'd earn extra pocket money teaching local business owners how to use their first computer that they might have bought for doing basic word processing and spreadsheets. And then when I went to university, I studied computer science. At the time, this was the early 90s. Microsoft had just released Visual Basic version 1, which was a rapid application development tool that really took off. And I recognized the significance of that. And so I taught it to myself. And I had a pretty successful self-employed training career in the UK until the late 90s. That was when the dot-com boom was happening in Silicon Valley. So I moved to America, lived in San Francisco. It was a very exciting time to be in the IT industry. And that was a fantastic experience, going out to the bars and seeing all the different startups and the different projects that they're working on, even though a lot of those, of course, flamed out at the time. I then moved up to Seattle to join Microsoft. And I helped them to educate the millions of developers worldwide that were currently using their products like Visual Basic and C++. And Microsoft at the time had just released their new C# programming language. running on the .NET framework. And since then, I've continued to be heavily involved in that world, helping developers of all different levels, from apprentices, 16 years old, coming out of school early, want to get into programming, all the way up to professionals who might have decades of experience. And they want to be able to get up to speed as fast as possible with this .NET development world, knowing that it's a rapidly changing world. Along the way, I have taken a few diversions. For example, I took a year off to do a sabbatical to study screenwriting at Vancouver Film School. And that was a fantastic experience, which has actually helped me as an educator in some ways. And I also was temporarily a maths teacher at a couple of London schools, and that also has helped my educational background. So I've done a lot, I've traveled a lot, I've had a fantastic life, and I really enjoy passing on my skills and knowledge to other people and improving their lives as well.
Well, that's a very impressive career, I have to say.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
I can imagine that it has. So I remember straight out of university, I went into a teaching role, and I was teaching maths. And from a personal point of view, I remember the joy of watching someone sort of figure something out. You know, the students would come in, they had no idea about Pythagorean theorem, and then 45 minutes later, there's one or two who it just clicks and it makes perfect sense, and the rest got it, but you know they're going to forget it because they're going off to another class in a minute.
Yes.
Just that when you see it in someone's eyes when they go, "Oh wow, yeah, that makes total sense," and that was an unbridled joy for me for a while. So I have to say I completely get the education background, not to the same extent that you have, obviously, but I totally get that. Presumably you see this every day.
I do. Even in my current day job, I still occasionally get to go into a classroom. It tends to be adults, programmers, professional programmers who are trying to update their skills or learn a new platform. And it's fascinating to see how professionals react to learning something new. I believe that for human beings, learning new things is one of the hardest things we do. And for a lot of us who are comfortable in our careers, it can sometimes be a shock going back into the classroom and having to absorb a lot of technical information in such a short amount of time. Because these days, we all have so many time pressures on us. Taking that time to absorb the information and really practice, get that hands-on practice, which is so vital to learning a new skill, can be a real challenge. And that's one of the things that I'm particularly interested today in my kind of career is how to help people juggle their personal lives with their careers, what their day job involves, but still giving them the space to be able to, as efficiently as possible, but still in a fun way, actually learn something that they take some joy from and can feel comfortable. Yeah, I really know that now, and I can apply it to my day job.
Yeah, that's the best part. Like you say, being able to see that deep knowledge. The way that it was described to me during my teacher training was the higher level knowledge, the ability to sort of self-reflect, take the input knowledge and reword it into your own understanding of how it all works.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's only when a student can do that, can then turn it around and either apply the kind of principles that they might have learned to a new situation, or yes, just reword it in their own language that they're comfortable with. And that, yeah, it's such a satisfying feeling because when they do that, you know that they have genuinely learned it and they're excited to have learned something new.
Definitely. I still see it from time to time myself. So I'm a contractor, and one of the things that I do is mentoring and sort of helping out with getting an idea for maybe a design pattern or getting the basics of, well, this is how this technology works. I guess on a very, very, very small scale version of, you know, what you've described that you do. And watching someone who previously had no idea of, say, Node, and then going, oh wow, I could do a hello world, and now I know what a hello world is, and then you walk away and come back 45 minutes later, they've got some kind of sorting algorithm, or they've got some data coming in, they're doing something to the data and sending it back out to a third party. It's amazing just to watch how fast someone can, once they have those fundamentals, how fast they can apply that knowledge and learn some more and build something else on top of it. It is absolutely amazing.
100% agree. And it's a genuine pleasure to chat to someone who has a similar kind of educational background. And I can geek out a bit with you, Jamie, about education, because not everyone is that excited about how to educate people and enabling those kind of activities.
Yeah. So from my background, I always found that I tried to figure out, we've gone slightly off topic, but I'm going to leave it. I tried to figure out how the student or the person that I'm working with can learn the thing that they want to learn best. So the canonical example that I give from when I was working as a maths teacher is working out the circumference of a circle.
Yes.
The circumference of a circle is a very dry topic. Pi r squared, and you've got the distance around the circle. Fantastic. But what I would do is, especially with the younger students, so this was secondary school, so 11 years old and up.
Yep.
What I would do is I would say, I'll draw a circle on the whiteboard or whatever, and we'll draw some lines on it and just make up some names for them. It doesn't matter what we call them. And then I would say, right, we're not going to work out any maths yet. We're actually going to go and get this, I don't know what they're called. It's a wheel on a stick that clicks every time it goes around.
Oh, yes, I know what you mean.
I would say to each of the students, we're going for a walk around the school. We're going to count how many times it clicks, and that's all we're going to do. So we walk a route around the building and listen to how many times it clicked, get back to the classroom, and then we'd say, okay, so it's maybe clicked 200 times or something. Write that down. Now take a ruler or a tape measure and measure the distance across the very center of the wheel. We'll give that a name. It doesn't really matter. Now we'll half it for no real reason whatsoever, because we only want to go from the middle to the outside. And then we'd apply the pi r squared to it, and we'd round up to figure out why it's 3 and why it's not 4 and why it's 3.2. And then by that point, we've then calculated the length of the route, because we figured out how far around the wheel, the distance of the circumference, and then how many times it's clicked. So we know maybe the wheel is 1 meter in circumference and it's clicked 200 times. We've just walked 200 meters. It's that application of it.
Yeah, and hearing stories like that from other maths teachers and different approaches to teaching the same subject, I find it all so fascinating. There was a YouTuber a couple of years ago who now works for Google, and he was a maths teacher in equivalent to secondary school, kind of high school in the United States. And I used to love his videos. He would use clips from sitcoms like Parks and Recreation in order to talk about probability or statistics and things like that. And it was great seeing how engaged his students could be when you can be a bit more creative than just the traditional teaching of things like Pythagoras' theorem.
It is brilliant, because then it makes it kind of real for the student. So let's say you were going to teach someone how to create, I don't know, an input form on a HTML web page. Well, yeah, you could talk about divs, and you could talk about spans, and you could talk about block elements and all this kind of stuff. Or you can say, right, let's just give it a name, whatever. Let's draw out a form on paper and go from there. The possibilities are pretty much endless when you're teaching someone.
They are.
We're talking about the extensive experience, I want to say, of your background working with the Microsoft stack. And I think this episode will fit very well with one that's planned to be released just before it. For those who don't realize, we record these a little bit ahead of time. And the episode that is planned to go out just before this one is effectively an interview where I've turned the tables. I'm the one being interviewed. And the interviewer is a developer called Josie Howarth. And the thesis of the episode is, how do I get started with all of this? So I think that combined with this one, I think will work really well, because you have the experience of showing people how to get started.
Absolutely. Yes, I totally agree that it sounds like there's going to be a really interesting fit between the episode where you get interviewed and this one where I'm being interviewed about my book. Because, I wrote my book to answer the question, where do I start? For readers who either want to learn C# and .NET for the very first time, or for readers who have maybe used C# and .NET a decade ago and they feel a bit left behind by some of the rapid changes that we've had recently in the platform, this book is where I hope they will get a great start. Because once you've completed the book, it's full of step-by-step detailed tasks that you can complete. Because one of the things that I learned with screenwriting, the kind of classic quote about screenwriting is show, don't tell. And I really believe that with education as well. So rather than going into long, detailed, conceptual descriptions about a particular language feature or an API call, I like to get in as quickly as possible and actually show some working code. Because I believe if you're typing the code yourself in small, relatively simple examples that you can actually run and see it work, that's a great starting point to then taking it further. Hopefully, readers will have been able to follow along, get that code working, and then wonder, well, what if I were to change this? Or does that mean that I could also do that? And try it on their own. Some books, I think, almost take you too far. I'm hoping to show you a broad enough range of topics to enough depth that you get the idea and that you've actually seen the code work. And then point you to further information, perhaps in the official documentation. Microsoft tends to do a great job of that, or to blog articles and things like that. And when you're reading those more advanced blog articles or the official documentation, you'll understand what they're trying to tell you because you've already now got that kind of solid foundation of skills to build on. So, where to start is, the primary goal of my book.
So just so that the listeners know, could you tell us the title of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the full title is C# 8 and .NET Core 3, Modern Cross-Platform Development. And it'll show you how to build applications using, of course, C# and .NET Core, but also some of the subcomponents of that, like Entity Framework Core for working with databases, ASP.NET Core for building websites, and even now in the 4th edition, I've added a brand new chapter about machine learning with ML.NET, which is Microsoft's set of class libraries that can help you add artificial intelligence embedded in any .NET application.
That is amazing. It does sound like it's like you say, a book that's aimed at a beginner, I guess, in the journey, or someone who has been on the journey and come back. But even the inclusion of the newer things like ML.NET, and I believe when we were chatting via email setting this up, you'd said that there's a section on content management systems as well. Is that correct?
That's right. That's another completely new chapter in this 4th edition of the book. Yes, about content management systems. Because what I've realized with my real world experience, actually going out into the world and implementing websites for businesses and charities all over the world, is that it's actually very rare that a website is built just purely on, say, ASP.NET MVC. That's what most programmer books might cover. If it's a book about web development with .NET, they would teach you all about controllers and models and views, the MVC design pattern, and of course the basics of HTML and JavaScript and CSS for creating the structure of a web page and the styling and maybe some client-side interactivity with some JavaScript. But in the real world, if you go to any big company or any organization that has websites, and all do now, of course, that's almost never what they're actually using for their public websites. They're going to be using a content management system because you need to enable the business users, the marketing department, maybe the people who are the merchandisers who are managing the product catalog, if it's an e-commerce website. Those business users are not programmers. They shouldn't have to learn HTML or ASP.NET just to be able to manage the content on their own website. And so as a .NET developer, I decided that it was quite important for us to go beyond just what Microsoft gives us in platforms like ASP.NET Core and actually have a look at an actual implementation of a CMS and show how that is then built on top of ASP.NET. So all of your skills are still very relevant in order for you to understand how the CMS works together with the data, merges it with templates that might be implemented as a Razor page or an MVC view in order to then turn it into HTML. But that's much more practical. That's going to give you some real world skills that you can then leverage to get a job with any business, really, that's going to be using a CMS. In my book, I wanted to make sure that I picked a CMS that was compatible with .NET Core and therefore truly cross-platform and open source. And at the moment, a lot of the bigger enterprise type CMSs like Episerver or Sitecore or Adobe Experience Manager, for example, those don't run yet on .NET Core. They will in the future, but not today. I also wanted to make sure that I could cover the topic of a CMS in just one chapter. So I decided to pick Piranha CMS, which is a really lightweight, fun, easy to understand CMS. You're going to learn a lot about the principles of how .NET CMSs tend to work that you can then leverage when you're then learning something like Embraco or Episerver. So I'm hoping that chapter will actually be eye-opening for a lot of .NET developers and actually leads to a lot of practical skill building. So we'll have to see. Have you ever worked with .NET CMS, Jamie?
Yes, I have. I've worked with Sitecore back in the .NET Framework days.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because I work almost entirely in .NET Core these days. And I also built something with Umbraco Headless and Blazor.
Oh, that's such an awesome topic. Yeah. We're using server-side Blazor.
So it was entirely client-side. Well, I say entirely client-side. There's obviously still a server-side to it to host the files. But yeah, all of the interactivity and everything was client-side. So entire .NET stack inside the browser. And this was Blazor 0.3 as well, so it was incredibly early.
Yeah, that's really on the bleeding edge, as they say. That can be very challenging when 0.4 comes out and things break. So you're a braver man than I am.
I did it for a talk as well.
Oh, even worse. I hope the demo gods were kind to you.
Oh, yeah, everything worked except for when I needed to log in live. I use Password Manager, and my Password Manager popped up on screen and gave everyone my email address.
Oh, yes, that is exactly the kind of thing that can happen when you're doing live demos.
The code all worked, I just hadn't logged in. That's the difference.
Yeah.
That was amazing too, because you're making a change in some thing that exists elsewhere. It felt very much like the inversion of dependencies principle. I'm making a change to some back-end storage of this CMS for this website, and then magically something on my browser just changed automatically. I didn't have to do anything. Maybe I have to refresh the page. And that's the magic of development. Like you were saying, the business user doesn't need to know the magic of the details of how it's all stored and how it all works. They just need to know, I got to this page, I changed the title of the page in whatever CMS I'm using. I don't even need to know it's called a CMS.
Yep.
I just need to know, I go to this URL on the website and I log in, I change something and it changes on the website.
Yep. Blazor is a technology that I'm super interested in, but as I kind of hinted at few moments ago, I wasn't brave enough to try and add a chapter into the 4th edition. But I can promise all the listeners to this podcast that Blazor will be in the 5th edition coming next year.
Fantastic. So we've got the inside scoop. You see, this leads into a question that I have. Unfortunately, we have multiple .NETs.
Yes.
We've got Framework and Core and Mono and Unity and Xamarin. They're all .NET-related technologies. To be able to say, yes, I will write this code in .NET and I can run it quite literally anywhere, versus 20 years ago when .NET first started and it was, yeah, we've got .NET and it's Windows Enterprise applications. 2002, we've got Windows, .NET. Maybe 2005, 2006, we've got Miguel de Icaza and his Mono project. and then you can kind of do .NET on Linux, but you can't because sometimes it's ahead of the spec and sometimes behind it. I'm wondering, what has that experience been over the last 20, 25 years of watching this technology that appeared as a Windows-specific, enterprise-specific thing, this admittedly hulky, slow framework that allowed you to do rapid application development, that is now incredibly small and installable pretty much anywhere?
Yeah, it's definitely been a bit of a roller coaster. As a .NET developer who makes my living from these technologies, I've had the same concerns that I think a lot of .NET developers have had in watching, particularly starting, say, 5 years ago, wondering what the future of the .NET framework is. Once it became tied to the Windows operating system, it, by necessity, had to slow down in the implementation of new features just to maintain compatibility. And although I think a lot of .NET developers at that time were fairly happy with the capabilities of the .NET framework 4.5, as developers, I mean, one of the things that I think draws people into programming is that we love new things. And so when Microsoft started talking about 4 or 5 years ago about .NET Core and approaching that as almost like a kind of reboot of the principles behind .NET and taking this more of an open source cross-platform approach, it was exciting but also very scary, because it raises all of those questions about what about our existing code? What about our existing investments that we've made in these technologies? And being aware of these other branches of .NET, as you mentioned, things like Mono and Unity. And Microsoft's first approach was to try and create, of course, the .NET Standard. And particularly 2 years ago, when they released the .NET Standard 2.0, it was a pulling together of all the major different branches of .NET so that it was a little bit easier for us developers to write code to target a single standard set of APIs. That was a great first step. But I was actually very pleased to hear at the Build conference this year, May 2019, when they made the kind of official announcement about final reunification almost of .NET into .NET 5 next year. It really helped to clarify where Microsoft sees where they're taking .NET. And I think it's going to, although be a little bit rocky as people start switching and migrating from .NET Framework 2, maybe .NET Core 3 in preparation for .NET 5 next year. I think most .NET developers are now feeling a lot more comfortable that Microsoft has taken the right approach to prepare for the next decade. .NET 5, 6, 7, having these annual releases, a bit like Apple does with their iOSs every second week in September. Now we can start getting used to every November. Starting November 2020, we're going to have a new version of .NET. That kind of regularity and a single platform, I think, is going to be fantastic. And I can almost see C# boost up the rankings of most popular languages, partly based on the fact that it can be used in a single version of .NET, whether you're using technologies like Blazor on the client side in a web browser or server-side, cross-platform, mobile devices. I think it's genuinely an exciting time to be a C# or .NET developer. Although it's almost 20 years old now, it feels re-energized.
That makes sense. So for me, I'm still a young one in the business, in that I've only really been in the development business for about 11 years. But my main concern going into Core was, at the time, I wasn't running Windows. I'd had some hardware issues with my Windows machines, and so I'd moved across, I'd migrated to Linux and Unix and looking into all of those things. So for me, when they announced .NET Core, I was like, finally, I can do .NET things in my own time at home. I don't have to learn another language or a framework. A few years ago, as the business that I was working for was preparing to move and go all in on .NET Core, I then started thinking to myself that the other developers around me were primarily Windows developers. And let's not beat about the bush. There is a fundamental difference in the way that Windows does things to the way that the Unix-compatible operating systems do things. So that was my main concern. Although I was very excited that, there's this whole new technology coming out that's based on some of the old stuff, a rewrite of it, ditching some of the old stuff, making it faster and cross-platform and all that kind of stuff. And then I'm thinking, What about all of these Windows developers who maybe are coming back to .NET? And not only do they need to learn .NET, but they've also now perhaps got to learn the differences in the operating systems as well.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge, both for Microsoft in designing their APIs or deciding how the .NET platform should react to maybe calling an API that doesn't make sense on a particular operating system. Definitely a challenge for them and for us as developers to be aware of those kind of differences. I'd love to see some statistics from Microsoft to see how many applications that are .NET Core applications are actively executed on these different platforms. But I suppose there's a lot of regulation, GDPR type privacy implications to that. It's a bit of a shame that they can't kind of add those kind of recordings to their framework. But yeah, you can totally understand why that's not a sensible idea.
Yeah, that's true. Going slightly off topic, I guess technologies like Docker tend to sort of make all of that go away, because then your underlying operating system is then an implementation detail. You don't have to worry about it. If your application and your ops system doesn't really matter so much, because although you are interacting with an API that is interacting with an operating system, you can swap the operating system out. And like you say, as long as the designers of the API have really thought about what should happen if, then it shouldn't really be a huge problem, should it?
It shouldn't, no. And Docker is actually something that's been kind of bubbling under my consciousness for a while now. And it's my plan for the quiet moments over Christmas is to try and get to grips myself with Docker, because I just haven't had the time yet. But that certainly seems to be containerization, those kind of ideas. That's really important for enterprise development.
Absolutely. So you said earlier on about how the book is really aimed at someone who's either brand new to C# and .NET or has touched on it before. So does that mean then that the book is incredibly detailed? Am I looking at something that's maybe the density of, say, The Art of Programming or Code Complete? Or am I looking at something that's along the same lines as an in-action book from Manning? That sort of, you're going to build an application and I'm going to teach you a little bit about it along the way? Or is it incredibly detailed because, like you say, you're touching on so many different things? You're touching on .NET Core, you're touching on ASP.NET Core, EF Core, ML.NET, and all that kind of thing. I guess the question I'm asking is it a huge amount of investment to get through the book?
Absolutely not. No, I've designed the book to be relatively, I was going to say lightweight. That can have negative connotations. What I mean by lightweight is it's not going to be a heavy read. Some of these books can feel a bit like you're wading through molasses just to get to the end of each chapter. I've specifically focused each chapter on a different topic, made them about 30 pages long with little tasks and exercises that will keep you motivated. So I think actually it's going to be quite a quick, fun read where you're learning lots of little nuggets of information, building up your skills and knowledge. So you won't have to wade through thousands of pages of details because those kind of details you can actually look up in the official documentation. While I show you maybe some basic functionality of a, say, particular class in the APIs, once you've learned those basics, you can always just click in the class name and press F1 to get to then documentation. And because I've told you the basic way that that thing works, then you can kind of take it further yourself. So at the end of each of these tasks, where you've got a lot of hands-on practical experience, you can see the code working on your MacBook or your Linux VM or even a Windows laptop if you're still using one of those. At the end of each chapter, there are links to further reference materials. So you're not going to feel overwhelmed by going through this book. At least that was my goal. And reading some of the Amazon reviews that are already up on Amazon, it seems to be resonating with readers, and they are finding it very. I think you mentioned that you had a couple of friends who found the book useful.
Yes, I have. A few of my friends are programming adjacent, I'll say, in that they're the type of people who say to you, I'm very interested in technology, but I haven't got a clue. And so I sat with them and said, look, why don't I teach you a little bit of what I do? and show you there's hundreds of different programming languages and technologies and frameworks. And in my opinion, I'm probably coloured because I've used .NET for so long. I do honestly think that .NET is one of the easiest to onboard someone with, especially with Core, because you just install an SDK. You don't even need any kind of development environment. You can use Notepad or whatever. You're good to go within moments. For instance, at university, the first lesson that we had in computer science was .NET based. The lecturer literally put his laptop onto the lectern, plugged in the overhead projector system, and said, right, I'm going to type out some code into Notepad, and it's in a big enough font that you can all read it.
Mm-hmm.
This is what it's going to do. And he pulled up CSC and manually compiled it from the command line and ran the application in front of us. And every single one of his lectures was done in that way. And somebody had said to him, why aren't you using Visual Studio? And he said, because you don't have to use Visual Studio to do all of this.
Yeah.
At least for me, one of the great things about .NET is that you could pick your own tools. You know, you're not tied to a specific piece of software to build your applications. So with these friends, I'd said to them, get a copy of this book because it's designed for brand new people, and I'll sit with you, and if you get stuck or if there's something you don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And they very rarely had to talk to me about anything. I think the one thing was, which version of .NET do I need to install? There's 2, 2.1, 3, 3.1.
Yes.
So that's the bit that they got stuck with. So I can say that from second-hand experience, I guess, of watching someone learning the basics of .NET Core, that the book is really quite good, I have to say.
That is so gratifying to hear, because new people to programming, I would say, is the audience that I personally feel the happiest in, that I'm helping out.
I do feel as though the next couple of years we're going to be seeing a lot of people come towards programming as more roles and jobs throughout the world rely more on programming. There's a person that I know called Sean Wang who 3 years ago, he worked in finance and, you know, made his money that way. And then he went away and took a boot camp, and now he's an incredibly prolific online person in the development space. He's made tons of money and got loads of exposure by learning to program and then going and teaching other people or talking about it. And I think that's going to be the next step in workplace evolution. You're going to have people who, I mean, we've seen it before with VBA. You had non-developers kind of writing scripts to help them with macros inside of Word files and spreadsheets and email clients. And I think it's just the next step along that trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a personal favorite new feature in C# 8?
I like the look of pattern matching, but I haven't been able to find an instance where I would use it. But it's the nullable reference types.
Yes.
It's a game changer. As someone who has written library code before, being able to say to the compiler, alert me when something could possibly be null. And then I'll just say, no, that's okay, that one's fine. Just seeing all of my code be littered with the little red squiggles of, you haven't thought about this, you haven't thought about that. And having the compiler just be that one step smarter and helping me to be smarter is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that new null handling behavior is genuinely a potential. I think when Microsoft was first saying that they might implement this, like 18 months ago, I think a lot of developers were nervous about what the implications would be if they made it mandatory. Luckily, I think they thought really hard. They had a very long preview for that null reference type feature. And I think they made the right decision in the end, in that if you're creating completely new code, you can take full advantage of that and avoid the infamous billion-dollar mistake, that even supporting nulls or allowing them in too flexible way, but also allowing you to maybe migrate existing code slowly over time and kind of opt in to that new behavior. So you're not suddenly overwhelmed by lots and lots of errors or warnings in your compiler. That's one of the things that I have always appreciated about Microsoft and their approach to developer tools and technologies, is that they really do understand the real world demands on developers, and they really put a lot of effort into making their platforms backwards compatible so that you don't have to completely rewrite everything and just junk everything that you've done in the past. Although .NET Core has been a long process, I think they have genuinely made it as easy as possible for existing .NET developers to make that jump. And now that .NET Core 3 and C# 8 have gone beyond what's possible with .NET Framework, literally there are some language features in C# 8 and certainly APIs that are part of the .NET Standard 2.1, which are not supported by the .NET Framework 4.8, now is the right time for .NET Framework developers to make that jump to .NET Core 3 in preparation for the unification to come next year. Yeah. Other really small improvements with C# 8 that I personally have got an irrationally large amount of satisfaction from are just simple things like switch expressions. Rather than having to use a big switch case statement, there have been a couple of situations where I've been able to really create a beautifully succinct switch expression. And it just made me very happy. And little things like tuples or tuples. What's your opinion on the correct pronunciation of tuple or tuple?
I've always pronounced it tuple.
Tuple. See, for me, that just makes me think of it only has two parts to it. And then it also then makes me think of, well, would it be a threeple or a thruple? Although we probably shouldn't get into that kind of thing. I tend to use tuple.
I don't tend to use tuples in code, but I genuinely see where they can be used. I think for me, the other big thing is the async IEnumerable is absolutely amazing, absolute game changer.
Yeah, really takes what Microsoft did with C# 5 when they introduced async and await and really leverages it in so many very powerful, very important situations. Yeah, I agree. Game changer there.
So with a developer coming into C# and .NET, that whole ecosystem, are these covered in your book? Is it important for a developer who is new to this to know that? Or are they just learning just enough to get them past the next set of tasks? And then maybe at some point you'll introduce async IEnumerable if it fits within the scope of what the book is trying to achieve.
What I've tried to do with this fourth edition of the book is to balance readers who are completely new to C# and .NET and not overwhelm them with technical or say performance-related features that would just be way over their head. So I haven't covered some of the really advanced performance improvements which have been made in .NET Core 3, whereas things like the new language features, which are genuinely useful, even in just day-to-day programming, I have included all of those. And that's partly where the book then becomes useful for that second audience, the type of audience who have maybe been using C# 20 years ago or 10 years ago, haven't really done that much recently, and they're now interested. They've heard about .NET Core, they've heard about some of these new language features in C# 8, they want to start embracing that. They will find pretty much all of those new features are covered, at least to an introductory level, with then references to the official documentation or the design decisions that were made around that language feature on GitHub, so that it can learn maybe why that feature was implemented in a certain way.
That makes sense to me because as a beginner developer, you maybe learn about control flow and for and looping and things like that, but you don't need to know exactly how a for each works and how it gets the enumerator and yields the return results and how link works on a low level. You can, when you're starting, just assume that it's magic, that when you put a where in and you do .where brackets, a bunch of esoteric characters, and then it eventually sifts through my collection and gives me the things that match. And then once you've done that, you can go back and learn what is actually happening. Yes,
and actually taking that as a specific example, for the beginners, I do just take the approach of, well, here is the syntax for a for loop. This is how it basically works. Let's see some code running. And then for that particular example, I will actually say, hey, are you wondering how this works? In a later chapter, I'm going to be introducing you to these things called interfaces, and there is this interface called IEnumerable. And so what's actually happening internally, the compiler is doing a bit of work for you. But if you don't want to worry about that, don't worry about it. I'm just giving kind of hints to the more advanced readers the ones who really love to know the nitty-gritty details about what's really happening underneath. I don't want to hide that kind of information from them, while also not overwhelming the beginners. So I will often show a little bit, or just have a little bit of a paragraph just to say, hey, in case you're wondering, here's where you can read more about how it actually works, for those of you who are interested. Otherwise, let's just move on to the next topic, and we'll learn about branching statements as well as looping statements, that type of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The phrase that I use is learning enough to be dangerous.
Yes. After reading my book, there will be a lot of dangerous C# ninjas out there.
I've always found that it's the juniors who call themselves ninjas. Those of us who've been around for a while don't bother with ninja or rockstar or anything stupid like that.
Yeah.
But that's my personal opinion. So where can people get the book from? What's the best place to do that? Is there a link on your website? Is it directly through the publisher? Is it Amazon? What's the best place?
My publisher, I'm sure, would want me to say that you should go to packedpub.com and purchase it through the website, either as an individual ebook or a printed version. Of course, it is also available on Amazon and all good bookstores worldwide. You can also purchase a subscription to a whole bundle of great content from my publisher, Pact, wherever you buy your IT books from.
Just look for C# 8 and .NET Core 3 modern cross-platform in whatever system or shop or whatever.
Absolutely. And as you can imagine, authors love to Google and search on Amazon for their own books. And I noticed yesterday that my book is the #1 bestseller in .NET programming on Amazon.com.
And I have some more questions in a moment, but what about getting in contact with you then? Is this something that you allow readers or other people like that to reach out to you to say, hey, I enjoyed the book, or is it something that you discourage?
I would encourage it. You can contact me probably best through my GitHub. My account name on GitHub is Mark J. Price. That's MarkJPrice. So I do get some very useful feedback about the code that's included with my book, which is available in a repository on my GitHub, and also just feedback actually about errata, typos and things in the book. So that would be where I would recommend, or Twitter, same username, Mark J. Price, or Gmail, same username, Mark J. Price.
Excellent. Okay, so people can get in touch and tell you what they liked about the book, that kind of thing.
Yes, I welcome hearing from my readers. And as we kind of touched on earlier, I have already started working on plans for a 5th edition. So if there is anything that a reader really feels that they'd love to see in the 5th edition late next year, I am very open to hearing those suggestions.
Okay, so that could be maybe go to GitHub and raise an issue. It doesn't seem like it fits.
Or just DM me on Twitter or shoot me an email on Gmail.
Okay, fantastic. One last question then. You've been through an extensive career of learning and relearning and teaching others, and your new book is about teaching new people the new technology, or teaching people who've already touched the technology but haven't gone into it in great detail a lot more about let's build something and let's talk about it and let's get a little bit more detailed, without giving away any of the secret sauce of how you are paid to teach people. What is maybe the one thing that you think is a great piece of advice to give out to someone who wants to learn something brand new, whether it's programming or mountain biking, or is there one piece of advice that works, or is there a piece of advice that you think you would give out to someone to say, hey, you want to learn how to do this programming thing? Here's the nugget that you need to keep hold of in your brain whilst you're learning.
I do have some advice that works for me. Obviously, I have a day job. So writing a book like this with 850 pages of detailed technical information takes a lot of effort. And the only way I was able to get that work done in a timely manner was by getting up at 6 a.m. in the morning, going to my local Starbucks, which happens to have a basement, and getting 2 hours of writing done before then going to work at 8 a.m. Putting aside at least 2 hours of time in a quiet environment where you've got some water, keep hydrated, where you can really focus. What works for me is early in the morning. What works for other people is maybe in the evening. If you've got a family, try and get away from them and really put in those 2 hours every day. It's about forming good habits that then keep momentum going. It's a huge challenge. That's something that works for me. I've been quite interested in reading about the political suggestion of a shift to a 4-day week. What I think I would do if I led a team of developers is I would try and persuade upper management to allow me to say, okay, we're not going to switch to an actual 4-day week, but what I want to be able to do is have a 4-day development week. And then 1 day a week, I want my developers to be able to work from home or go to a cafe and spend those 8 hours learning something new. And in order to get management buy-in, maybe I'd have to say that that's going to be directly relevant to the job. But personally, I think even if the day job, the 4-day week was C# and .NET development, I'd say, hey, if you want to learn Python and if you want to learn about machine learning, go ahead, spend those 8 hours learning something new, because that releases the creativity, seeing a different language, seeing how it can be implemented. When they're then doing those other 4 days work, they will be refreshed, interested, and I honestly believe more productive than if they were working 5 days. That's what I would do if I was managing a team of developers. Develop for 4 days, learn for 1 day, whatever that learning is.
I like that, primarily because it scratches the itch of wanting to help someone learn something, but also because I believe that it's been said before, no one can know absolutely everything, but the industry that we're in requires the discipline of lifelong learning.
Yes, that's a skill that you have to practice. And so by having management buy-in, in understanding that dedicating 1 day, it's not a waste. It's absolutely vital to building those skills in learning something technical and complicated in an efficient way so that you can then put it into practice. Yeah, I'd love to see all businesses kind of have that approach to lifelong learning.
Well, I think that's a great point to leave the episode on, I think. That works out really well. Thank you ever so much for agreeing to spend part of your Friday evening when you should have been relaxing and doing whatever it is that you do to enjoy your Friday evenings, whereas instead you're sat talking to me, which is not so relaxing.
It's been a genuine pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've had a fantastic time, and it was really interesting hearing your background as well. So maybe in a year or two, I'd welcome an invite back.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, let's talk about version 5 of the book when it comes out. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's talk about that, definitely. And maybe we can get some of the audience to submit some ideas for things they'd like to hear for version 5.
Oh, that's an awesome idea. Yes, excellent.
Just before we go then, could you just remind us of the title of the book again, please?
So the title of my book, C# 8.0 and .NET Core 3.0, Modern Cross-Platform Development. And I'm Mark J. Price.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much. That was my interview with Mark Price. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full, searchable transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for some more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.